Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Masterclass webinar. We'll give everyone a few moments here to get in and get settled, and we will begin our presentation shortly. I see our numbers are going up, so we will give you just a few more moments here. All right, it looks like everyone is in the webinar. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Masterclass webinar, Winning Your Audience, Expert Tips to Improve Your Public Speaking, featuring James Rosebush, founder and CEO of Growth Strategy, Inc. My name is Emily Stringer, and I will be your moderator this afternoon. A little background on me. I work as an ambassador to the imbue Advantage program, and as one of our compliance officers. I've been with imbue Partners for 10 years. Next slide, please. Here at imbue Partners, we are contractor engagement and compliance specialists and are the chosen compliance partner for over a third of the Fortune 100. Our mission is to make it easier for large enterprises and top independent talent to work together. For more than 20 years, we have been leading the charge to keep the independent economy moving forward, building a unique dual-sided ecosystem featuring many of the world's most prominent companies and in-demand professionals. imbue has always been committed to advancing the next way of working, and we are far from done. We will continue to drive change on the ground, delivering innovative solutions that enable both organizations and talent to thrive in a constantly changing workplace. imbue Partners has several upcoming events, including our third and final segment of Building Your Online Presence. For more information in this and other events, please visit us on the web at www.imbuepartners.com/events. Before we get started, I have a few housekeeping items and friendly reminders for today's presentation. Please ensure that you are muted. At the end of today's presentation, we will host a formal Q&A session. Please use the Q&A function to send us any questions you would like James to answer. We will also be emailing a slide deck and a recorded copy of the entire webinar to all registrants within the next week. At this time, it is my pleasure to introduce you to our speaker. James Rosebush is a widely recognized public speaking and executive coach, a leader in building and growing corporate, family office, and philanthropic organizations. As an advisor to the White House, James was President Ronald Reagan's point man on philanthropy and public-private partnerships. Mr. Rosebush was also the longest-serving chief of staff to First Lady Nancy Reagan. He recently published his third book and #1 bestseller in the public speaking category, Winning Your Audience, Deliver a Message with the Confidence of a President. This follows his bestseller, True Reagan, What Made Ronald Reagan Great and Why It Matters, a rare insight into the 40th president's mysterious character. James is a frequently requested public speaker, presenting to various audiences and the media on leadership, politics, and philanthropy. His weekly columns on leadership and public speaking appear on BusinessInsider.com and Real Leaders magazine. He co-created Deal Ring, a platform to train investment managers to make the perfect pitch and compete successfully for investment dollars. He also coaches business leaders to become impact speakers through his website, www.impactspeakercoach.com. James, at this time, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Emily, and a shout out to Matthew Small as well, and all my friends at imbue for inviting me to come into your offices and wherever they are and share with you what I call my Power Up Masterclass in 14 points in 40 minutes. I'm going to be speaking to you in an accelerated delivery. We'll talk a little bit about that because I want to cram in as much information as I can possibly get to you in 40 minutes. It's going to be divided into two sections, followed as storytelling. Speaking is all persuasion. Storytelling is what people want to hear. The second section is building a bridge to your audience. 7 points in each section. But my mind has really been focused on the testimony from the four tech titans in Congress yesterday. How many of you watched this or observed any of the analysis after they finished their testimony? It's fascinating to me that the cost of not being able to communicate well goes on and on. These people didn't possibly recognize the fact that not only were they testifying in a smaller, to a smaller group of people on Capitol Hill, they were really speaking to millions and millions of people around the globe, customers, shareholders, and analysts who were parsing the words that they were presenting. To me, I don't know how you felt, but they really weren't connecting to their audience. They didn't have the highest degree of authenticity, and they certainly were not rehearsed. Those three critical features, which we're going to talk about today. There's a tremendous cost associated with not being able to speak effectively. Most of our colleges and even MBA programs, only 22 schools out of all MBA programs across the country offer and require a public speaking class to be taken. I think it's more important to learn how to speak in public than to take an accounting course. And as evidence that these CEOs showed us yesterday. This is what I want to do. And I'm terribly impressed with the fact that you all do recognize how important it is to gain your voice and your ability to convince, persuade, and to unify yourself with your audience. Thank you for recognizing that and joining with this class and with this group today. We have an impressive number of people who've signed up for our discussion. And I love that because it's saying to me that people are getting this message that you have to learn how to speak. This can range from speaking to your kids, telling them to try to do their homework, which is of course a big problem today, or to eat their dinner, or to get to bed, or if you're negotiating buying an apartment or buying a house, things that are personal. The ability to communicate is tantamount to everything. This course doesn't mean that I'm training you necessarily to be speakers to 1 million people, although that could be a part of your role and responsibility coming up. It's just as important to learn how to speak correctly and powerfully and effectively to one other person as it is to 1 million people, as my boss, Ronald Reagan, did. I saw him become an evangelist for freedom around the world and had the great opportunity to travel with him. And wherever we went, he believed if he could only communicate effectively directly to the people, that he could win over through his voice and through his content and through his conviction related to his beliefs, he could win over his audience. So I learned 1 million lessons from him. So let's plunge right into this Power Up Masterclass in 14 points over 40 minutes. And then we'll have an opportunity to discuss some of the things that are of greatest concern to you. So I want you to learn how to speak as if your life depends upon it, because it really does. Think about this. If you were tossed in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, you have to learn how you'd have to have the ability to communicate and make a distress call. You'd have to get that message through to the right people. You have to make the connection to someone who's going to save you. That's your audience. But you have to throw out that call for help. You have to learn how to communicate. Communication skills begin, of course, when we're born, but the way we gain them is we mimic our parents. We listen to how our parents are speaking, their inflection. If they may have a particular slant on language, depending on what country they're coming from, or how they've been trained to speak, or what kind of accent they might have. As children, we pick all of this up. These are things that we might have to correct later on as speakers, because we're really going to be judged on our ability to communicate. So first and foremost, we're focusing on section 1, remember, right now, storytelling. All speaking is persuasion and selling. So the first point I'd like to talk to you briefly about is the history of public speaking, the origins of it. So in the early days of the Greek Empire, joining together in the earliest form of democracy, all the scattered Greek islands came together to form this nation, which we now call Greece. Why did they do that? Because they had to defend themselves against the conquering armies. And so they thought we would be stronger together. They also recognized that to be stronger together meant that they had to be able to communicate. So they created the laws of rhetoric, which were put together by Aristotle. And he had 5 different laws that he felt were critical to not only an individual's ability to speak to their family or to their tribe, but most importantly, to uphold the pillars of democracy. And I think this is why I like to talk about the origins of it, because what is it that really powers us and gives us this incentive to be important and powerful and effective public speakers? Because we are upholding the pillars of, could be our own family, our businesses, our companies that we work for. We are upholding these pillars by learning and practicing proper rhetoric, by storytelling, and by focusing on content. These are all things that are critically important. This is what the early Greeks did. So they trained and they created the first actual speaking coach. His name was Corax. And Corax opened up, put his shingle out, and he started training and actually charging people to be trained, because the Greek economy, the Greek political economy, as this early democracy, knew that in order to sustain their freedoms and their democratic way of life, they had to be able to communicate about it. Later, as we shift to the early Roman Empire, they had no lawyers, and you had to go to court individually to plead your case and to seek your property rights or anything else that you had to go to court for. And I often think, if we didn't have lawyers today, everyone would have to be an eloquent public speaker. So why is this so important to know about the roots of speaking? Because I think it helps imbue us and inspire us with the responsibility to do this. Every single one of us, especially those that believe in and support a democratic way of life and individual freedoms, we have this important role to learn how to speak effectively and convince people through storytelling how important it is. That's number one. Number two, today we have a journalistic style of speaking. So what does that mean? So you find that if you open up any blog or if you open up any newspaper today, every single article you'll see, look at the Wall Street Journal today. So there was an article about, obviously an article about COVID. It would naturally start with, well, James Smith, who lives in Nashville, opened his door yesterday and he found out that 5 members of his family had COVID-19. And why did this happen? So you find any story is going to open with a vignette about an individual or a group of people or an accident that happened or some incident. So this is the way we always want to open up our own remarks. And I always like to tell the story of how I learned that I had to become an effective public speaker. So when I was 20 years old, I joined the family office of the founder of General Motors. And the first day, in the first week that I was on the job, I was sitting behind my desk and I heard machine gun fire coming through the front door of our office, which was a big glass door, and all the glass was shattered. There were 6 ski mask gunmen who came to take us hostage. So all of us dove under our desks, grabbed our phones, and they were aiming not for us because we were not a high value target, but they were aiming for the gentleman who ran the office, the son of the wealth creator. He was thrown into a room-sized safe and he was kept without harm. 5 hours later, we were led down the fire escape by the SWAT team. We were safe. But what happened was transformative for the organization and for this gentleman as a leader. He asked me to begin a strategic planning process that would focus on whether or not we were having impact. That led me 10 years later to be asked to run the White House Office on Impact. But before I leave that, I tell you that I was also invited to be a Rotary International Scholar. They sent me to the Soviet Union. And this was right after I had started my first job. So for 2 months, I go to the Soviet Union and I'm assigned to meet with Politburo leaders who were 4 times my age and 5 times my girth. So it was a fascinating experience, but everywhere I went, I was tailed by intelligence officers. So at the same time, I warranted an intelligence dossier because they thought I was a spy. Again, 10 years later, I find myself negotiating on behalf of the Reagan White House with Soviet leaders on a different platform. But when I go back to, again, when I was at age 20 and I had this experience in the Soviet Union, when I returned to the US, I had a big requirement that was put on me as a result of earning this fellowship from Rotary. And that was I had to speak to Rotary clubs all over the country. Well, I thought, this is interesting because I had been trained by my dad, who was a Dale Carnegie public speaking coach. And he'd always just drill all of these Dale Carnegie rules into me, which was great to learn. But I now recognize that I had stories to tell. And this was critical for me to be able to stand up in front of these important business leaders in the local communities where I was speaking and tell stories that illustrated points I was trying to make. That gave me my content. That gave me the ability to tell stories. And we're going to talk a little bit about how you can do that as well. But I want to finish up on point number 2, and that is that accelerated delivery. This is journalistic style of speaking, telling stories and using a journalistic style of delivery, which I call now accelerated delivery. If you ever watch David Muir on the Evening News, or now some of the others are picking this up as well. They want you to hear, it's a fast delivery. They want you to hear as much information within their 22 minutes that is allotted for them to be news readers. And you feel 2 things as a result of this, that they're smarter because they're speaking fast, and number 2, that they're efficient in using your time. So you're attracted to listening to them. And as speakers, I want you to remember this as well. It is important to move your message along, and not to be deliberate, but at the same time, be mindful of your audience, because most audiences suffer a significant degree of hearing loss. So you also want to be thoughtful of your audience. But I think accelerated delivery, journalistic style of storytelling is definitely the way that we're doing this now. That's point number 2. We did, number 1 was historic origins. Number 2 is journalistic style of speaking. Number 3, the mind grabs hold and remembers what? It remembers pictures. So what you want to do is you want to paint pictures by telling metaphor, by creating metaphors. One of the great examples is my friend who is the recently retired curator of Northern European and Dutch painting at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. When he gives a lecture about a painting, he may put the painting up in front of him, but what he tells is the story of the political economy at the time of when all these great paintings were being done in Amsterdam. He depicts the life that was around these artists and why it was important that they were painting these pictures and what they were conveying. You are you're transported to Holland at that time. And you can relive this, you can see it with your own eye, the way he is picturing it. Telling a picture, painting a picture is a very effective way to be able to communicate a message. Think about what Arthur Wheelock does in describing those Dutch paintings. Number 4, so that's number 3. The mind grabs hold and remembers pictures. Use visualization to help people remember what you're saying. Number 4, collecting and retelling your own stories. So we have this big phenomenon today that all of you are familiar with, which is through podcasts and bloggers and webinars. People are basically everywhere, and influencers, because it's an entire industry. They are bent on telling their stories. Now, I find this can be tremendously tedious, and I think it can be also a way to really manipulate people, but at the same time, it's very popular. People want to hear what other people have struggled with and hopefully have come out as the victor. So you're starting out with Oprah, Susie Orman, Wayne Dyer, people who have made vast fortunes, not just influencing, but telling their own stories. Now, you might say, well, my life is not interesting. I don't really have any stories to tell. But that's not really true. You do have interesting stories to tell. And it could be a conversation that you had with one of your kids. It could be a conversation you had with someone you work with. It could be a traffic stop where you were getting a ticket. It could be the mundane things of life. And you watch these people that you think are convincing in telling their own stories a lot of what they're sharing with you is everyday. Why? Because people relate to the everyday experiences that we are all having. They don't want to see you as a speaker removed from their aura or from their connection. They want to see you as a fellow traveler. They want to see you as a fellow sufferer, but they want to get something out of it that you have learned. So this requires what I call living an interpretive life. This is what I'm asking you to do here in point 4, collecting and retelling your own stories. The way you can do this is to live an interpretive life. So every day, and a lot of this we can do through journaling, think about the day you live every life and make notes about it. It could be, as I say, it could be a conversation with a friend. It could be a conversation with a child. It could be a conversation with a parent. It could be an incident that happened to you at the gym. Anything that is going on in your life or your observations of life, even the things that you read, that's living an interpretive, curious life. And to be an effective speaker, you really need to be curious. I started out by talking about how I felt about it and asking you how you felt about the testimony that these technology company CEOs gave yesterday on Capitol Hill. I'm curious about that. I wonder what you think about that. That's a way for me to connect with you, because if you've seen it or you've even read about it, the chances you probably have an opinion about it. This is living an interpretive life. One time I was giving a talk in San Francisco and a woman stood up afterwards and she said, I'm a millennial. We have a terrible time connecting with other people. Do you have any advice for us? I said, yes, as a matter of fact, I do, because I hear this complaint all the time. How do I connect with other people? This is a part of living an interpretive life. And I'll give you this clue, I said to her. Go up to someone who's at the other end of the bar and say, where were you born? They will inevitably say, well, I live here in the Bay Area, blah, blah, blah. And then you say, no. I really want to know where you were born. And then the person may say, well, I was born in Mexico City. Oh, that's really interesting. I went to Mexico one time, and what do you blah, 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 blah. That, I will assure you, will begin a bridge to your audience of one person. It will begin to open up a relationship for you, because it means that you're curious. People are flattered when you ask them a question, and you have to be sincerely interested, but it is a way to cause a bond and open up a relationship with another person. That will also help give you something to talk about, because you've learned something from this person. As a millennial, a lot of millennials, not true of all, of course, but a lot of millennials are just have not been trained, or they don't have the natural instinct to do this, but it's causing them a lot of problems in their jobs because they're not connecting. Be curious, live an interpretive life. Number 5, you can also tell the stories of others. You don't have to talk about yourself. I think it's a terrible idea to talk about yourself, although it's a huge phenomenon today. There's no question about that. So how do you do that? You can read obituaries. Now that sounds sort of dark, but I can tell you that obituaries are like reading living history. So when a person passes away and someone writes an obituary, even about a person of maybe not even great accomplishment, they're fascinating stories to read. You can report on those. You can retell those stories that you learn by reading obituaries. The Times of London has these fabulous page-long obituaries of people. You find interesting things about people that have survived World War II, survived concentration camps, have built companies, have written music. All of these things are stories that you can retell. You can say, yesterday, I learned about this Ironman he'd been in 5 Ironman competitions. And the way he got there was, which is one of my coaching students, rowed his boat without any power, from Laguna to Hawaii. And en route to Hawaii, he got a call offering him $3.2 billion to buy his company. So he made his transaction in this small boat that he was rowing from Laguna to Hawaii. I mean, this is astounding, right? So these are interesting. To me, I find that a terribly interesting story about him. Now, I can use that to make a point. And I never talked about myself. But I did reveal the fact that I was curious about that. And I wanted to find out what exactly made this guy. Why could he both appear on the cover of Men's Today magazine because he's a great Ironman athlete, and on the cover of Fortune magazine because he's an extraordinary business person? So I think these are telling the stories of other people, and you get to it by being curious and living an interpretive life. You can also do fictionalized stories. So very often in TED Talks, or like Brene Brown, if you know about her, these are things that, again, you can create stories. You can say, you can pattern it after a real story, but you can change the facts. You can certainly change the names. You can change the place. The point is, you're actually molding words that you're trying to get across by giving an example. Now, isn't that the best way to teach a child? So I was having a conversation last night with someone, and they said, well, I didn't like the way my kid was sitting at the dinner table, is making too much noise. So I said, if you went to the White House today and you were invited there for lunch, you're talking to a little kid, would you make all of that noise? Wouldn't you be more polite about speaking in public? So again, this is using examples as storytelling to make a point. Critically important to be able to do this. So that's fictionalized stories. That's point number 6. 7, employing stories and metaphors to support a point. So again, you can go into historical accounts of people who have endured tremendous heartache, or endured collapse of government. And I think very much about my friend Aniko, who at age 6 in 1954, when the Soviets were marching into Hungary, she escaped and she walked over fields of bristles and barbed wire in her bare feet to get on a freight train that eventually took her to Spain, that eventually got her to Canada, where she lived and then eventually came to America to live a free and successful life. But did she ever forget that? No. She always remembered the cost of freedom to her and to her family. And she's been a champion of freedom ever since. As a matter of fact, she is chairing an initiative to bring to the world's attention the terrible effect of the signing of the Treaty of Trianon, which was 100 years ago, and how it dispersed the peoples of Central and Eastern Europe, and especially the Hungarians. So there's a story about a person that you can use as an example. Reagan did this all the time. And if I had more time, I would share that with you. We may come back to that. So here, this first section is complete. Storytelling. All speaking is persuasion. In 7 points. The historic origins of storytelling. Using the journalistic style and advanced or speed presentation. 3, the mind grabs hold and takes these images and remembers them, images that you're talking about, the paintings, Arthur Wheelock. 4, collecting and retelling your own stories, being and living an interpretive life, being curious. 5, using the stories of others. 6, using fictionalized stories that you make up. And 7, employing stories and metaphors to support and a point and paint a picture. Those are our 7 points of storytelling. Now we're moving quickly on to building a bridge to your audience. Now this is critically important to understand that at least 65% of all communication is nonverbal. So what do I mean by that? So in 1971, Dr. Moravian explored this consciousness communication. And he said that, as a matter of fact, he assigned a high percentage of communication associated with nonverbal but consciousness communication. So I will tell you that before you even utter a word, your consciousness or your thought about your message and yourself is communicating itself. So when you go out to an audience, either physically or virtually, like most of our presentations are today, people will hear, I say that could be silently, or they're catching your authenticity. they're catching or they're making a determination about what you're thinking and how you are presenting and the importance of what you think about things. It is communicated non-verbally. So why is this critically important? Because most people miss this and they don't understand the fact that we all know this phenomenon. Oh, I was thinking about Carrie and she called me on the phone 5 minutes later. So we all have these experiences, right? So you have to recognize that it's the mental connection with your audience. It's the mental connection that's more powerful than the physical or the verbal connection with your audience. So it's important to at least value this and understand where that's coming from, and to recognize that. So what do you do about it? Well, you imbue yourself with the importance of your subject. You think about that. And the degree to which you're thinking about it can reflect on your whole audience to the degree that they're receptive to it. That's your responsibility. You know, a lot of people think that getting up to speak or talk to anyone, or no matter the size of the crowd, is just something that is mechanical. It's not. You have to take responsibility for it. And it's not just a matter of writing a speech. And some people say to me, well, is it okay if I use notes or if I speak from a prepared document? It's fine to do that as long as you deliver it in a conversational way or a journalistic way. So really the best way to put together a speech, and this is a whole nother part of a course that I do, but it's called The Architecture of a Great Speech. But what you really have to do is you have to build your speech or your remarks around what we just covered, stories. And you can really conquer your fear of or concern about making a coherent presentation by just saying, I want to tell you 4 stories. Well, I want to tell you 3 stories, never more than 3 or 4, by the way, but I want to tell you 3 or 4 stories. Now, these are things that illustrate the points that I'm trying to make. And you know what they'll remember when they walk away? They'll remember the stories, and they're going to associate the stories with the points that you were making. So this is number 1, nonverbal communication and defeating fear are terribly important. So one time I said to Margaret Thatcher, you know, you're such an accomplished speaker. Are you ever fearful? She said, oh, Jim, of course I'm fearful all the time. And I said, you are? I mean, you're called the Iron Lady, all this. And she said to me, and I said, what do you do about it? And she said, well, every time I get on a podium, she said, I have to talk to myself. And I say, look here, old gal, you can do this. You're not afraid. You can conquer this fear. And then she said, what happens is my message takes over. And I get so devoted to and so committed to and so inspired by my message that the fear disappears. Why? Because the ego quiets. Fear is the big disconnect with your audience. Fear is operating to disconnect you and to say we, they. It's not. It's we are together. The audience and you are together as one. Fear tries to say you're separate. This is where the ego is speaking to you. Let your content take over. I saw this time and time again. If you see, for example, presidents giving the State of the Union address, especially President Reagan started having heroes come in. So every president has heroes come in the visitors gallery. So I could see the president get so inspired by those heroes that it makes his speech glisten. So put things in your speech that inspire you, because the audience wants to hear you excited and you inspired about your message as well. That's one way to defeat fear. Second, bring down the 4th wall. This is critically important. You know what the 4th wall is? So let's say you're a performer, you're a musician, or you're giving a speech and you go on stage. Generally you have a wall behind you. You have walls to the right or left, but what's in front of you? What's in front of you? That's the wall dividing you from your audience. You must bring down the 4th wall. You absolutely have to bring that 4th wall of division down in order to build a bridge to your audience. You have to build a bridge so your words can go across the bridge, and so your audience can come back across the bridge. So you have to tear that down. So one time I took Nancy Reagan to a graduation of a drug abuse center. It was a huge, massive gymnasium. There were hundreds, maybe over 1,000 parents and students. And in the middle of the room, they had this platform, and they would announce the name of a kid, and they would say, okay, you're clean, you're going home. So the kid would run to the middle, meet the parents. They devolved into tears. The whole audience was crying. So we're sitting there. The Secret Service is crying. The Secret Service is not allowed to cry. The White House press corps is crying. They wouldn't want you to know that they were crying. So I'm sitting next to Nancy Reagan, and we had prepared remarks. She was like, okay, we have to tear those up. Absolutely, right? So she goes, after this, like 2.5 hours, they thrust a microphone in her face, and she has to talk. Well, we tore up her prepared remarks. So she turns to the parents. She tells them how much she loves them, how much she understands the hurt that they've just gone through. She turns to the kids, and she says, I love you. You have a great life ahead of you. I'm here to support you, blah, 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 so forth. So I think when she entered the hall, people thought this could be a political stunt. Afterward, they carried her out on their shoulders, the kids. The White House press corps is saying to me, what happened to her? Well, what happened to her that night is she had to speak from her heart. This is what brought down the fourth wall of partition between her and her audience. And I said to her in the car in the back, on the way back to the hotel that night, I said, this is one of my favorite quotes. Whenever the heart speaks, no matter how simple the words, they're always acceptable to those who have hearts. That is really what happened. That's bringing down the fourth wall. 3, we have to fire through these. Being fully briefed and doing your research. I tell you that those tech CEOs, I didn't feel were fully briefed. I didn't think they really knew their audience. They certainly know their topic, but you have to relate the topic to your audience. So I remember, for example, one time going to speak at the University of Michigan at the Gerald Ford Presidential Library, and I thought I was going to be speaking to university students, college students. So that's how I prepared well, bad for me. I didn't do a sufficient amount of research on what the audience was going to entail. So when I get up there to speak at the podium, I look out and there was standing room only, but they were all retirees. Well, that was great, but I had to pivot my remarks. Now, if I had given the remarks I planned to a college audience, it would have missed the mark. You want to hit the mark. How do you do that? By understanding and doing the research about who your audience is. Again, going back to those tech CEOs, they didn't realize that they weren't just speaking to members of Congress. They were speaking to their shareholders and stakeholders and analysts around the world, as I said. So you have to be fully briefed. You have to understand who your audience is. 4th point, where you look, your body language and your voice pitch help build this bridge to your audience. Now, how is it that they do that? So I once worked with, not too long ago, with a gentleman, a mature guy who had a very high-pitched voice. He was embarrassed by it, so he never wanted to give a presentation. And yet, he was the head of a company, and he's saying to me, I have to do this. How am I going to do it? And I said, I took a basketball and I pushed it into his stomach. And I said, take in the hot air from your gut, move that air up through your vocal cords. Because he had said to me, there's no way I can change my voice. I can tell you that right now. And I said, you absolutely can change your voice. Why do you want to have a deeper and more resonant voice? Because the human ear hears deeper sounds better than high-pitched sounds. That is the way it reaches. And it also grabs their mentality and makes them pay attention. The high-pitched, now it's very interesting also that over the past 4 decades, women's voices, their pitch has gone down. The more powerful women have become in the workplace and in corporate settings, the lower their pitch. That's important because people generally take a lower pitched voice more seriously because number 1, they can hear it better. And number 2, it sounds more powerful. So this is all part of your body language. There's a lot to talk about this. We can cover this in Q&A. And your voice pitch and your body language. You certainly want to make a presentation that you are comfortable, and pay attention to what you wear. Pay attention to all of these details, which you can get by reading my book too. Last 3 points here. Is your material, I would say, have you really prepared material that your audience really wants to hear? So in the White House, we had a man named Peter Robinson, and he was a speechwriter. And he went to East Berlin, and he asked the East Berliners, he said, what would you like the president to say when he comes to, Reagan was going to celebrate the anniversary of the historic city of Berlin. And they said, oh, we want him to say to Gorbachev to tear down our wall, tear down this wall. And he comes back to the Oval Office, he tells the president gets very excited about this and writes it in his speech. Everyone else takes that out of his speech when they edit his prepared remarks. He puts it back in when he gets to the Berlin Wall at the when he goes to Berlin and he's making this at the Brandenburg Gate. He's making this speech, and he says to his aide, he said that the boys at the State Department aren't going to like this. He put it back in, and he says that those famous iconic words, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Now that resonated because he knew his audience. His intended audience, of course, was Gorbachev. He had established enough of a relationship with him to know that as his audience, he wanted Gorbachev to let that wall come down. That's why he used in his inflection and emphasis, he said, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It wasn't Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. It's Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He'd already been talking about walls. He was directing Gorbachev to do something. So he had the credibility to do it. This is understanding what your audience wants to hear. I implore you to think about that. Don't make remarks that you want to hear for yourself. Make sure they're what your audience wants to hear. The last 2 points. What is what you say, what is heard? Now, do you follow me here? We usually think that when we hear ourselves say something, that another person is hearing it the same way. I would say in 90% of the cases, that is not true. You could say, for example, tonight I want to eat a hamburger. Or you could say, I want to eat a hamburger. And someone could say, well, maybe in 2 weeks he wants to eat a hamburger. Or when I was negotiating with the Chinese, for example, at one time, I kept asking for things and they kept saying no. And finally, when we got back to the Situation Room in the White House, we thought we had completely failed. It was going to be a global news story of complete failure. They had acceded to all of our demands, but they couldn't say it to us. They couldn't really take what we were saying, what we thought we were saying. You have to think about how what you're saying, the words you're saying, are being received by your audience. Again, this is this section of really understanding and building a bridge to your audience. And last, before we just get to Q&A here for a few minutes, the last point, again, one of the most important, is to make your audience feel that you're together with them. You're not separate. You're not a person who's either so important because you know your subject or you don't think you're important enough to warrant their listening to it. So I have 2 examples where I had a conversation on the South Lawn of the White House with Mary Martin, who is this famous film actress and stage actress. And I said to her, I said, what makes you so successful with your audience? And she threw her arms around me and she said, Jim, 2 things. I was born in Texas, and second, I was born loving people and they loved me back. I'll never forget that as long as I live. She loved her audience and they loved her back. Your audience wants to feel your love and your affection and your interest and your care. If you give them that, they're going to give it back to you. And lastly, I don't know if any of you have ever watched reruns. Probably I'm going to say that now for this audience. I can't see all of you, but I'm assuming certain things that the audience from Carol Burnett shows, which were absolutely hysterical and entertaining over, I think, 13 seasons. She had a song that she sang at the close of every one of those shows. And the words in it were, it's been so nice to be together. And to me, that is a capstone and sort of a way to summarize the best kind of relationship that you want to end up with your audience. It's been so nice to be together. That is a way that really can symbolize a relationship between a speaker and an audience. It's been so nice to be together. And I feel that way about you all today. And again, just to summarize, these 2 points we powered through here: storytelling, building a bridge to your audience in 14 points. It's been nice to be together, and now I'm going to turn it over to Emily and try to answer a few of your questions. Can't hear you, Emily.
All right, sorry about the mutes. James, thank you for such a wonderful and informative presentation on a topic that many of us are curious about and where we all want to improve. Folks, for those of you who would like more information on James, please feel free to visit him on LinkedIn, drop him an email, visit his website, or purchase his book, which is an incredible read. With that said, before we jump to our Q&A session, we are going to put a quick poll up on the screen for each of you so that we can get you any information that you would like after the presentation. Are you interested in learning more about imbue Advantage or imbue Marketplace? imbue Advantage is our subscription program for independent consultants who are looking to get a competitive edge on their competition, work on their public positioning, and have the opportunity to network with other elite consultants. imbue Marketplace is our platform where you can post a profile to bid on independent contractor work. Let us know if you would like information on either of these two topics, and we will get that out to you as quickly as possible. With that said, James, we will go ahead and jump into our Q&A session. We have several hot topics here that I've seen pop up quite a few times. So first, we will cover Zoom. We've had several questions about Zoom. That said, do you have any tips that you can share with our audience when it comes to public speaking on a virtual platform such as Zoom?
So that is obviously a very frequent question that I get today. And as I, every day, am giving master classes on Zoom, and we are all of us having meetings with groups and individuals on Zoom. So I think it is tough. I think it's different. I think it's weird. That you're speaking to people sometimes that mostly I'm speaking to people that I don't ever see or that I don't know. I think that the point I made about loving your audience, though, is something that it emanates from your own heart. So even though you can't see the images of the people that you're necessarily communicating, you're negotiating with, I think you can still feel an appreciation for your audience, even though you're not seeing them. And you have to work through that. You have to admit to yourself, look, this is how I feel about my audience. Because again, remember I talked about that important point of the nonverbal communication, or it also works for not being able to see your audience as well. They can still feel what you're thinking about them. So be watchful of that. I think also to be careful about your appearance. I have to say, maybe in the beginning of COVID, I was having an awful lot of meetings with people who were sitting up against their bed head, or they're, in what I consider to be sort of random and too casual situations. And I recognize that everyone's under pressure to actually, a lot of people are speaking and meeting from their bedrooms. But I think you have to be conscious of when you do see people on Zoom, the backdrop, the lighting, these are all things that you need to take into consideration as a speaker.
Great, James. I think that's wonderful advice, and especially in the current climate, we can all benefit from those tips. So thank you very much for sharing. The next hot topic that we've had come up several times is stage fright and anxiety around public speaking. So can you share with us your best tips on how to overcome that stage fright?
Sure. So, of course, 75% of all people in the world suffer from what's called glossophobia, which is a fear of public speaking. So this is remedied well, I have a whole chapter on it in my book. So it's remedied by maybe 5 or 6 different steps, which we won't go into in tremendous detail. But I think, first of all, it is, like I mentioned in the story I told you about Thatcher, it's being more interested in your content, in your message, and getting that, really being inspired by it, than you are in yourself. Because fear really comes in when the ego takes over. that's something that you have to really beat down. And I'll tell you the story of the first time, and Ronald Reagan having been ultimately called the great communicator, when he was a sophomore in college, it was the first time he ever gave a public speech. Years later, I went to that stage and gave a speech myself. But this is what happened to Reagan. So Reagan is actually leading a charge of students to get the president of the college fired. You wouldn't think of Ronald Reagan as the person doing that, right? So they want to pull all the students together to get this college president fired. He said to himself, I'll never forget that speech as the most important one I ever gave, because I overcame fear because I was getting a response from my audience. That's the fastest way to get rid of fear, is to get he said every comment I made was met with an uproarious response and enthusiasm. So put yourself in your remarks, tell a story that gets a response from your audience and gets them really in a groove with you. And then you will become relaxed and you'll say, well, you know what, maybe I'm not doing so bad. But again, becoming more interested in your subject and your content than you are with yourself or thinking about what you look like. Also, I mean, there are a million little tips, but when you get up to speak or make a presentation, wear clothing that you like. Feel good about yourself. Overcome the fact that you might be thinking, oh, I shouldn't have worn this shirt, or I shouldn't have worn this jacket, or, I didn't shave today, or maybe you don't want to shave. But whatever it is, put yourself in a position where you feel good about yourself. And that, I think, it's a part of winning the fear. But it's a big battle. Martin Luther King said the only way to defeat fear is through faith. Faith in something more powerful than you.
That's excellent advice, James, and something that I think many of us can use. Wow, 75% of people have some sort of anxiety around public speaking. That's really astounding. No wonder this topic came up several times. Next, let's jump to, how do you go about researching your audience?
So, as I mentioned to you, this is so important, and there's no excuse for not doing this work, by the way. Absolutely no excuse. So, you know that if let's say you have a small audience and you're making a sales pitch to these people, you're even making a phone call. People, and I should add that, fear of public speaking isn't just people who stand up and talk to millions of people. There are people who actually have a fear of picking up a phone, making a sales call. And these are things that we're really fearful of, and lack of confidence about either our subject or our ability to make the pitch or presentation is at every level of society. So I think that knowing your audience and doing the research about who your audience really is, you don't have to be a president of the United States with a full staff of people doing that research. I mentioned that one example. You need to find out yourself. A good example, so Emily and Matthew and your whole team at MBO, we talked about, well, who will this audience be today? What kinds of people are signing up for this class today? So I was very interested to learn a little bit about, because you didn't know exactly who all would be signing up, but you had some ideas. We talked about it. And I think those avenues are available to anyone who's making a pitch. And I think just as if you were selling a product or a service and you were making that pitch to someone else and you were speaking to them, it's important that you know something about them before you do that. Because, of course, the best way to sell is not to force a product on someone, but to ask them, how could I be of help to you? Well, you have to know who the you is, right?
That's great advice, James, and something we can all learn a bit from. For our next question, can you review Aristotle's 5 laws of rhetoric?
I do have that here, but it has to do with, you can look it up yourself, but it has to do with cadence. You know what cadence is? Cadence, rhythm, elocution, presentation, and diction. So these are, those are the 5 things. So, and one of the things related to rhetoric, which I think is so critically important and is just not ever really taught, or rarely ever taught by anyone, and that is emphasis. We talk about this in this book, Winning Your Audience. but I gave you the example of Reagan saying, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. So there are clues where and there are laws of proper emphasis and cadence and rhythm. These are all fascinating. And I think one of the big lessons that people use who do teach rhythm and cadence is to have people learn how to speak Shakespearean sonnets, because it takes tremendous skill to bring out the meaning when you are actually speaking and repeating Shakespearean sonnets or reading the Bible. You have to do it in a way that's picturesque and has the right cadence and rhythm, and also taking breaks in what you're saying. Some people will say to me, well, what if I get to the end of a sentence and I don't have another sentence to say? And I will say to yourself, first of all, the little word is no longer permissible. So you don't have to say but you can get to the end of a sentence like this and stop for a split second before you go on to the next one. Because the way the human mind is thinking is basically it's going to take bracketed material. And you also want to be able to understand the words that are correctly emphasized, because that brings out the right meaning. So that's basically what a lot of Aristotle's laws of rhetoric are about. And if we only learn more of those laws, we would be more successful as salespeople, have a greater ability to get along with people, because we would recognize that what we're saying is not always what is heard, and we would win more business.
Great advice, James. The pause is very powerful, and I think sometimes we lose sight of that. One quick note, and we will jump to 2 more questions and then wrap this up. Several folks have asked when they will be receiving a copy of this recording. We will get that out to each of you who have registered for this webinar within the next week. There are no slides that will be coming. It is a masterclass, and you will receive a copy of the masterclass. James, 2 more questions before we get this wrapped up. How do you engage an audience that has different age groups?
Very good point. I think that what you have to do, I think that's a big challenge. But let's talk about one thing that is related to this. So you've seen me at times during this masterclass use my hands or use my arms. And I'm getting to the answer to your question, but it strikes me that we should talk about this for a minute. A lot of people are very concerned about hands. What happens to them? Should I put my hands in my pockets? Should I put my hands behind my back? I happen to have a chair here that I'm leaning on. Should I put my hands on the podium? So this is a basic rule about hands. Use hands as if they were exclamation points or grammatical. So let's say today I'm going to cover 2 points. See? Storytelling and building a bridge to your audience. Or we're going to have 7 points that we're going to cover in this. So I'm using my fingers to indicate these numbers. Or I am so happy to see all of you. Do you see what I'm doing here? So I'm just using my hands as gestures to support what I'm saying verbally. Otherwise, I keep my hands down. And if it's difficult to do that, as I said, rest your hands on this chair, which I have here. Rest your hands on the desk. You can put a hand in a pocket, but do not overuse your hands in hand gestures. That is something that will take energy away from what you're presenting, and it will distract the audience. Keep your hands away from, but use them to support. It could be an exclamation point like this. It could be a gesture to include everyone. And getting back to your question, it made me think about, you want to make sure that everyone in the audience is included. So if you have children or you have elderly people or you have a mix of people, I think you have to throw in things that are going to be interesting to everyone. And that is probably one of the most challenging types of audiences to speak to. But I think storytelling, again, is the way to conquer that. And you might have to tell stories that would be of interest to, if your audience is of mixed ages and mixed generations, you need to be careful about the stories that you're telling relating to the not only the interests of the people that are coming in the audience, but the ages as well.
That's wonderful advice, James, and much appreciated. For our last question here, to kind of add on to that, how do you recover or re-engage your audience when they quit on you or go south on you?
Oh, that's of course everyone's great fear. Are you talking about if someone is loses interest? Obviously, loses interest in what you're saying. So that's okay. So I'll tell you that at the beginning, when people were, saying when phones were really ubiquitous, they would say, "Oh, turn off your phones. You can't bring your phone in if you're giving a lecture or you're giving a talk." And then, of course, that all kind of went away because where anyone is, they have their phone, and it's usually on. So what happens in the beginning, when I saw people on their phone, I thought, oh my gosh, I've lost their interest. They're not paying attention to what I'm saying. Now I've seen in my speeches over the past maybe 2 years, 3 years, that people are actually taking notes on their phone. So that's a confirming kind of feeling that you get from that. So I think that my best answer for that is to say, don't despair because people are going to sleep or they're yawning or they're talking to someone or they're on their phones or they just don't look interested. I think the way to conquer that, though, is perhaps to raise the level of your voice. Again, storytelling, throw out a story that's of interest, or ask a question. Now, to go back to that architecture of a great speech, which we talk about importantly, never leave your audience without asking them questions. So you want to have a takeaway. So a way to, I think, awaken someone who's in your audience is to throw out a rhetorical question. Like, what do you think about, or who do you think is going to win the World Series? Or what do you think about when is Major League Baseball really going to come back in full force? Throw those questions out. Now, that doesn't mean you're waiting for a verbal answer, but it challenges people in the audience to start thinking and to wake up. Throw out a question and get them, bring them and reel them back in to your content and your presentation. Again, I say this is work. As a speaker, as a communicator, this is not anything you can be lazy and relaxed about. It is your responsibility to deliver the pitch and to make sure that it reaches its intended audience and that it has an impact. That is your responsibility. No one else is going to do it for you. But there are tools that you can engage and that you can adopt for yourself and where you can be tremendously successful. You can conquer fear. You can become the great communicator. You can have a home run for anything that you need to pitch, sell, persuade, or communicate today. I have confidence that all of you can do this.
James, thank you so much for the presentation and the informative Q&A. This was wonderful and a topic that resonates with so many folks who do have that fear of public speaking or want to improve. Now that we're all in situations where we need to present ourselves, even if it's as simple as on a Zoom meeting with our teams at work. So thank you very much for joining us today. This was wonderful. To my fellow team, thank you for the production. To those who have joined us today, we appreciate having you on the line. We will get your copy of today's presentation out to you within the next 7 days. And we look forward to seeing everyone online very soon.